right, everyone, get ready, because today we are going deep, deep into the mind of Noam Chomsky
Oh, boy.
and his book, How the World Works.
Yeah.
We found this really great YouTube video that breaks it all down,
Mhm.
and I think it's going to be super helpful because, Chomsky can be a little bit of a challenge to
He can be dense.
unpack sometimes.
Yeah, he's not known for his accessible writing style. Let's just say that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the ideas are, I think, so powerful and relevant, like especially today.
I totally agree, yeah.
Yeah.
What really struck me was how he, cuts through the surface of what we call democracy
Uh-huh.
and exposes some pretty unsettling realities about power, you know?
Yeah, it's that idea that even in systems that seem free and fair on the surface,
Right.
there are these deeper forces at play, often manipulating things for their own benefit.
Yeah, and he uses this phrase, a vile maxim,
Oh, yeah.
to describe how elites essentially put their own interests above the needs of everyone else.
Right.
And it's interesting because he connects this back to someone you wouldn't expect. Adam Smith.
Yeah, Adam Smith, right.
The father of capitalism himself.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Even Smith
Yeah.
had concerns about how merchants and manufacturers could, game the system
Uh-huh.
for their own profit.
Right.
So this isn't a new critique. It's something that's been observed for centuries.
So it's not just about bad guys being greedy. It's more about the system itself being designed in a way that allows for this kind of manipulation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And Chomsky uses a really concrete example to illustrate this.
Mhm.
The dismantling of the Bretton Woods system in 1970.
Oh, yeah.
This led to this huge surge in unregulated financial capital,
Uh-huh.
which, he argues, really only benefited a small percentage of already wealthy people
Right.
while leaving the working class behind.
Yeah, it's like this built-in imbalance where the rules of the game favor those who are already winning.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, how do they keep the rest of us from noticing or from doing something about it?
Yeah. How does that work?
Yeah.
Well, that's where this idea of manufactured consent comes in, right?
Right.
It's a concept that Chomsky uses to describe how power structures, particularly through the media,
Okay.
shape our perceptions and beliefs without us even realizing it.
So it's not necessarily about outright lies or propaganda, but more about, subtly framing the narrative to benefit those in power.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and that brings us to Chomsky's really scathing critique of the media.
Yeah.
He does not hold back.
Oh, no, he does not. In fact, there's this quote in the video from the Chicago Tribune
Okay.
advocating for the U.S. to basically act as willing mercenaries in a global protection racket.
Whoa, hold on.
That's pretty strong language.
Mercenaries, that's intense.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the Tribune is using hyperbole to make a point, but
Yeah.
what point are they even trying to make?
Well, I think the point Chomsky's making is that the media, even when seemingly advocating for a strong U.S. presence in the world, often does so in a way that ultimately benefits corporate interests.
Right.
This idea of protection can very easily slip into something much more self-serving.
So it's about connecting the dots, seeing how even seemingly unrelated events can actually be part of a larger pattern of manipulation and control.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Chomsky argues that this manipulation isn't just happening domestically.
Right.
It's a key part of U.S. foreign policy as well.
Which leads us to his next big idea, the U.S. as a global enforcer.
Mm-hmm.
He's pretty controversial on this point.
Yeah.
He basically argues that U.S. foreign policy is all about maintaining global dominance,
Right.
especially preventing developing nations from becoming truly independent.
Uh-huh.
And he uses some strong language to describe this, calling the U.S. the world's rent-a-thug,
Yeah.
arguing that its military power is often used to enforce the interests of corporations on a global scale.
That's right.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Uh-huh.
Does he back that up with specific examples?
He does.
Because otherwise it just sounds like wild conspiracy theory, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, he dives into the history of U.S. intervention in various parts of the world,
Okay.
pointing to events like the 1965 coup in Indonesia,
Okay.
where hundreds of thousands of people were massacred.
Oh, wow.
It was actually praised by some in the U.S. media as a victory against communism.
That's chilling.
Yeah.
So he's saying that the narrative we're often given about these interventions, that they're about spreading democracy or protecting freedom,
Right.
is often a smokescreen for something much darker.
That's his argument.
Okay.
And it's not just about military intervention either.
Right.
He talks about economic warfare.
Okay.
How the U.S. uses things like illegal embargoes and the IMF to control weaker nations and kind of bend them to its will.
So it's a more subtle form of control, but just as effective, if not more so.
Potentially, yeah.
He even suggests that the war on drugs, while presented as a fight against crime, could be seen as another tool for targeting marginalized communities and maintaining social control.
Yeah.
This is getting pretty heavy.
It is, but it's important to remember that Chomsky isn't just trying to make us feel depressed about the state of the world.
Yeah.
He's trying to, wake us up to the reality of how power operates so that we can actually start to do something about it.
Okay.
You know?
Right.
It's more of a call to action than just, wallowing in despair.
I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we do that?
Well, that's a good question, and we're going to get into that
Okay.
as we go deeper into Chomsky's ideas.
Let's do it.
Yeah. But first, we got to take a quick break.
Okay. Sounds good.
It's easy to get caught up in those, big, dramatic examples of power and control.
Right.
But Chomsky also points out how these dynamics play out in more subtle, everyday ways.
Like how? Give me an example.
Well, take globalization.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like a natural progression, right? Free markets, interconnectedness, everyone wins. But Chomsky sees it as something much more deliberate and calculated.
Yeah.
He calls it corporate mercantilism.
Corporate mercantilism. That sounds kind of ominous.
Yeah.
What exactly does he mean by that?
He's basically saying that globalization, as it exists today, isn't really about free trade at all.
Okay.
It's about powerful corporations, often with the backing of their governments, manipulating the system to benefit themselves
Right.
at the expense of workers and less powerful nations.
So it's like they're rigging the game in their favor,
Mm-hmm.
even though they're telling us it's all about a level playing field.
Yeah,
And the media helps to sell us this idea, right?
exactly.
Okay.
Chomsky argues that the media often focuses on the supposed benefits of free trade
Right.
while downplaying or ignoring the negative consequences.
Like what?
Like job losses, environmental damage,
Okay.
exploitation of workers in developing countries.
It's that manufactured consent thing again.
Right.
We're being told a story that makes globalization seem inevitable and beneficial, even though it might not actually be in our best interests.
He uses NAFTA,
Oh, yeah.
the North American Free Trade Agreement, as a
Sure.
prime example.
Okay.
He argues that it was designed to benefit corporations and investors, often at the expense of workers in both the U.S. and Mexico.
And of course, the media played a role in selling NAFTA to the public,
Right.
focusing on the potential for economic growth
Exactly.
while downplaying concerns about job losses and environmental impact.
It's about shaping the narrative
Right.
to serve powerful interests,
Okay.
even if those interests don't align with the needs of the majority of people.
Right. Right.
And Chomsky argues that this kind of manipulation is pervasive, affecting not just our economic lives, but also our social and political realities.
Okay.
It really does make you think.
It's pretty unsettling to think about how easily we can be influenced without even realizing it.
Yeah.
But if these systems are so deeply entrenched,
Uh-huh.
how can we possibly challenge them? It feels kind of hopeless, to be honest.
I understand that feeling.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these problems.
Right.
But Chomsky believes that awareness is the first step.
Okay.
Once we start to see how these systems operate,
Mhm.
we can start to make different choices.
So it's not just about tearing down the old system, but about building something new in its place.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
What would that even look like?
He talks about the importance of organizing,
Okay.
building movements,
Mhm.
and creating alternative institutions that can challenge the dominant structures of power.
Like what kind of institutions?
Things like community-based media,
Okay.
worker cooperatives, and direct democracy initiatives.
So it's about empowering people at the grassroots level, giving them more control over their own lives and communities.
Exactly.
But those efforts often seem so small compared to the massive forces we're up against.
It's true that systemic change takes time and effort.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen overnight.
Right.
But Chomsky believes that even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect,
Okay.
inspiring others to get involved and building momentum for change.
So we don't have to wait for some grand revolution.
Right.
We can start making a difference right now in our own communities.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty encouraging.
He points to historical examples of social movements that started small, but eventually achieved significant change: the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
the anti-war movement,
Okay.
the movement for LGBTQ rights.
Right.
These movements didn't succeed because of a few powerful leaders.
Right.
They succeeded because ordinary people came together and demanded a better world.
So it's about recognizing that we're not powerless, that we have the ability to shape our own destiny.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel like we're just cogs in a machine,
Uh,
but we actually have more power than we realize.
but how do we combat that feeling of hopelessness
Yeah.
that can creep in when you're faced with such enormous challenges?
Chomsky argues that despair is a luxury we can't afford.
Wow.
He believes that we have a moral obligation to act,
Okay.
to resist, and to fight for a better world,
Right.
even when the odds seem stacked against us.
So it's not about ignoring the problems or pretending they don't exist.
Right.
It's about acknowledging them and then choosing to fight for something better.
Yeah, it's about choosing hope over despair
I like that.
and action over apathy.
Okay.
He says that hope isn't something that's given to us.
Right.
It's something we create through our actions.
So it's not about waiting for someone else to save us.
Yeah.
It's about taking responsibility for our own future.
Exactly.
And Chomsky believes that this fight isn't just about changing the world out there. It's also about changing ourselves.
Yeah, that's an important point.
He emphasizes the importance of critical thinking,
Right.
questioning the narratives we're given, and developing our own understanding of how the world works.
It's about becoming more conscious and aware of the forces that shape our lives.
So it's about personal transformation as well as social transformation.
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand.
We have to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and beliefs,
Right.
to be open to new ideas and perspectives.
That's how we grow and evolve,
Okay.
both individually and collectively.
Now, we've talked a lot about Chomsky's general critique of power and globalization.
Right.
But he also delves into specific cases where he sees these dynamics playing out in the real world.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious to hear his take on those specific examples.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Okay, so let's get into some of those real-world examples. You mentioned that Chomsky takes a pretty controversial look at events like the U.S. intervention in Somalia
Right.
and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear his perspective on those.
Well, he really challenges the conventional narrative, especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy.
Okay.
For example, a lot of people view the U.S. intervention in Somalia as a humanitarian mission, a well-intentioned effort to help a country in crisis.
Right.
But Chomsky sees it very differently.
Yeah, I remember reading that he was pretty critical of the motives behind that intervention.
He argues that it was more about projecting U.S. power
Okay.
and controlling the narrative
Yeah.
than about genuinely helping the Somali people.
Right.
He even points out that the timing of the intervention was quite convenient for the U.S.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the U.S. swooped in after the worst of the crisis had already passed,
Oh.
when it was relatively safe for their troops,
Okay.
and there was good media coverage to be had.
Oh, I see.
It allowed them to look like heroes without taking on as much risk.
So it was more about PR than actual humanitarian aid?
Well, that's Chomsky's argument.
That's a pretty cynical take.
Chomsky is definitely critical of what he sees as a pattern of U.S. interventionism that's often driven by self-interest rather than altruism.
Okay.
He also critiques the focus on military solutions, rather than addressing the complex political and social issues at the heart of these conflicts.
And he brings up the Battle of Mogadishu, which
Yeah.
was depicted in that movie Black Hawk Down.
Yes, and it's interesting because he acknowledges that the film is technically accurate in its depiction of the battle,
Uh-huh.
but he argues that it misses the larger context of the U.S. intervention
Okay.
and its ultimate failure to achieve lasting peace.
So it's like we're getting a very narrow,
Right.
almost sanitized view of these events, a
Sure.
view that's shaped by media narratives that don't tell the whole story.
That's a recurring theme in Chomsky's work.
Okay.
He sees this disconnect between the rhetoric of U.S. foreign policy and its actual impact on the ground,
All right.
a gap between the stated goals and the messy reality.
It's almost like we're being told a fairy tale
Yeah.
while the real story is much darker and more complex.
He applies the same critical lens to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
Okay.
which is probably where his views are most controversial.
Yeah, I've heard he's been accused of being anti-Israel for his stance on that conflict.
It's important to understand that Chomsky's critique is focused on the policies of the Israeli government,
Uh-huh.
particularly its treatment of the Palestinians.
Okay.
He doesn't deny Israel's right to exist
Right.
or downplay its security concerns,
Okay.
but he argues that its actions, particularly in the occupied territories,
Uh-huh.
are often disproportionate and counterproductive.
So he's not saying that Israel is inherently bad. He's saying that its policies are creating more problems than they're solving.
Right, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
He's especially critical of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza,
Right.
which he sees as a form of apartheid that denies Palestinians basic human rights and makes a peaceful resolution to the conflict even more difficult.
That's a pretty strong accusation to make.
It is, and it's certainly a controversial one.
Okay.
He's also very critical of the U.S. role in this conflict,
Right.
arguing that its unwavering support for Israel, including billions of dollars in military aid,
Yeah.
enables Israel to continue these policies and undermines the possibility of a just and lasting peace.
So he sees the U.S. as complicit in this situation, not just a neutral observer.
That's his argument.
I can see why his views on this issue are so controversial. He's challenging some very deeply held beliefs and assumptions.
That's what makes Chomsky such a fascinating and provocative thinker.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to question authority, challenge the status quo,
Right.
and speak truth to power,
Okay.
even when it makes people uncomfortable.
So after hearing all of this,
Yeah.
all these critiques of power, manipulation, and injustice,
Yeah,
it's easy to feel overwhelmed and even a bit hopeless.
I understand that.
Where does Chomsky leave us? Does he offer any solutions, any reasons for optimism?
Well, Chomsky's work can be quite bleak at times.
Right.
He does believe that a better world is possible.
Yeah.
He emphasizes the power of collective action, of people coming together to challenge unjust systems
Right.
and create a more just and equitable world.
So it's not about individual saviors or waiting for someone else to fix things.
Right.
It's about all of us taking responsibility and working together to create change.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
He sees hope in the countless acts of resistance and solidarity that are happening all over the world.
Yeah.
People standing up for their rights, fighting for justice, and building alternatives to the dominant systems of power.
It's about recognizing that we're not powerless,
Right.
that we have agency,
Yeah.
that our actions can make a difference.
Chomsky's work is a call to awareness,
Okay.
a challenge to think critically,
Uh-huh.
and an invitation to engage in the struggle for a better world.
Yeah.
He reminds us that while the challenges are great,
Right.
so too is our capacity for hope, courage, and collective action.
Wow. This has been an incredible deep dive into Noam Chomsky's How the World Works.
Yeah, it's been a good one.
His ideas are definitely challenging, but they've also given me a lot to think about. New ways of seeing the world and my place in it.
It's not always comfortable to confront these uncomfortable truths,
Right.
but it's absolutely necessary if we want to create a more just and humane world.
And as Chomsky reminds us, that change starts with each of us.
Yeah.
It starts with being informed, engaged, and active participants in shaping the world we want to live in.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
We encourage you to explore Chomsky's ideas further and see how they resonate with your own experiences and observations. And remember, even though he might focus on the problems, Chomsky ultimately believes in our capacity for positive change.
That's right.
It's up to each of us to take on that challenge and run with it.
Absolutely.
Thanks again for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you.